Hello, everyone. My name is Garvin, and I read things and chatter about them on the internet for your entertainment. So, today we continue our examination of the myth of Atlantis and how it evolved over time into our modern view of Atlantis today. We started, as you always should at the beginning, with Plato's work because that's the original telling of Atlantis. We then took a look at Sir Francis Bacon's unfinished novel to see how the idea of Atlantis had changed by the early modern period. In Sir Francis Bacon's time, many people envisioned Atlantis as being on the North American continent, for example, and he uses that in his story. Last week, we looked at what I argued then and am going to continue to argue is the single most influential work about Atlantis in the modern world. Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which has completely overwritten Plato's description and is the version of Atlantis most modern media uses and most people see in their imaginations. This week, I'm going to present to you an old piece of fiction that supports that argument. Atlantis, the Lost Continent by Charles John Cutcliffe Wright Hyne. And I dare you to say that name 5 times fast. Now, this story was published originally in serial form in a magazine named Pearson Magazine, and it ran from July to December in 1899. It was then reprinted as a novel in 1900. It would be reprinted in 1972 by Ballantine Books, then in 1974 by Oswald Train, and in 2002 by Bison Books, and lastly released by Armchair Fiction in 2017 as part of their Lost World, Lost Race fiction series. The 1974 and 1972 versions, I believe, had forewords written by Lynn Carter and Harry Turtledove explaining the influence this story had on them. Now, I have found a free to read version through Gutenberg Press. I'm going to have a link to that in the description below. Before I jump into the story, let me talk a little bit about the writer. Charles Hyne, because I'm not saying his whole name again and you can't make me, is actually more well known for an adventure series he wrote set in the modern world about a sailor named Captain Kettle. This was popular enough that one of those stories was made into a movie in 1922 named The Adventures of Captain Kettle. Another interesting bit here is the illustrator of the stories basically used the likeness of Joseph Conrad for the character of Captain Kettle. Mr. Conrad, it is said, returned the favor by lifting phrases, set pieces, and ideas from the adventure series to use in his work, the famous novel Heart of Darkness. The Lost Continent is Mr. Hyne's most well-known fantasy novel, although he had written a number of fantasy works as well as science fiction, but we're just going to focus on Atlantis here. The Lost Continent uses a framing narrative, the framing narrative being that the unnamed narrator, who was on vacation on the island of Gran Canaria, one of the Gran Canaria Islands, accompanied an archaeologist named Coppinger on a brief 2-man expedition. There he finds a set of hidden tablets that Coppinger translates into the main tale of this story. So the idea is that this is not actually a fantasy story, but a translation of a real archaeological record. The story itself is set in a fantastical prehistoric era where Atlantis is the sole civilized power on Earth. It is a grim, dangerous world where mankind is locked in a struggle with prehistoric monsters ranging from plesiosaur-like sea monsters, dinosaur-like lizard creatures, and great cave bears and tigers. All of these creatures have no problems attacking even large groups of armed men and are only fought off with great difficulty and sacrifice. I'll admit, as a world, this setting is interesting to me because, if nothing else, it flips the narrative that was taught to me in my college classes upside down. Those college classes, which were longer ago than I care to admit, taught me that as humanity spread out of Africa, uh, it was actually humanity that put the other species in danger, as megafauna often found itself besieged and hunted to extinction. Now, I have tried to keep up to date. My understanding is that the current scientific consensus is that it's actually a bit more complicated than Humanity shows up, and if you weigh more than 500 pounds, you are doomed. In a lot of places, humanity apparently showed up during periods of great environmental change and stress and managed to catch a number of large species at the worst possible moment and just kind of tip them over when they were already struggling. But that's a bit off topic, so I apologize for wandering off. Our main character, ducalen, is the regent of the colony of the Yucatan in Mexico. Although when the story starts, he's being recalled back to Atlantis after being an independent ruler in all but name for 20 years. Through discussion with his replacement and friend Tahoe, he learns that the new empress, Foretsnia, has decided she has a greater need of him at home. The mere fact that Atlantis is ruled by an empress is a great change for ducalen, as tradition has said only a man of the priest clan chosen by the priests themselves can rule. However, Foretsnia seized the throne by main force. See, she was adopted by a member of the priest clan as a child, learned their secrets covertly, and on top of that was smart enough to come up with her own inventions to equip an army with dangerous new weapons called fire tubes. And once she got started, no one could stop her. However, her rule is not stable or safe. Rebellion burns across the continent, and the priests resent Foretsnia not just for being an upstart genius, but for claiming that she is the daughter of the gods themselves, and therefore has just as much divine right as the priests do. I gotta be honest, I feel like if the story was written in the modern day, the Empress would be the hero instead of ducalen. She would also have a much different characterization, I think, because in this story, she's written as hedonistic, vain, and rather uncaring of everyone around her. Her view is that everyone in Atlantis exists to serve her rule, and if they die so that she can keep ruling, well, they should be so lucky. ducalen, on the flip side, really isn't Mr. Caring and Gentle either. In the story, he states very plainly that he thinks nothing good can come from, quote, coddling, unquote, the common folk, and you should always make sure everyone has to work for their food and clothes to keep people from having the time and energy to get into trouble. That said, he does also believe that government officials shouldn't enrich themselves at the cost of the common people, and that it is part of a ruler's responsibility to make sure that there's plenty of food and clothing to be had for the common folk if they'll work for it. So, in my view, he's honestly the better option of the two. That said, I like that both of these characters very clearly have different values than modern readers, and that helps center the story as taking place in a much different world. It creates a sense that Atlantis is a different culture and civilization than ours, and that this isn't the modern world LARPing has a fantasy setting. Now, at first, ducalen does attempt to work with the Empress, hoping he can steer her into a more moderate path of not crushing the common people into starvation and homelessness while she feasts on rare fruits and meats in a gold-plated pyramid palace. This quickly breaks down for various reasons, and ducalen and the remains of the priestly class find themselves having to openly duke it out against the imperial armies. This does not go well at all. And the priests, besieged on their last mountain fortress, have to invoke the old gods. Interestingly enough, the Empress outlawed the worship of those gods. That was another bone of contention, and demanded that everyone worship her instead. So it's with some wrath that the gods respond, and their response is to drown Atlantis, with the exception of our main character and his lady love. So, it's a happy story. So this is a fantasy story. So members of the priest clan do have actual magic they can use, but it's less D&D fireball and more ritualistic magic that causes earthquakes and other natural disasters, or curses to make men go blind, or contract leprosy with a touch. I do like that Old Testament flavor there because, well, thankfully today, leprosy is completely curable. Chalk one up for modern science. Leprosy was the terror of the ancient world, and I think most modern fantasy writers tend to overlook that. If you're a writer, consider interjecting some of that into your stories. Just a thought. So, as you can guess, this story really isn't anything but a fantasy. It's an interesting fantasy, but it's really dated. Given that it's over 120 years old, this shouldn't be surprising. However, there's also a lot of outdated writing technique here, like a lot of telling instead of showing. Often we're given summaries of major events by the main character instead of seeing them firsthand. And there are large time skips within the novel that make me feel less like I'm reading a novel and more like the Cliff Notes study guide version of one. There's also a fair amount of sexism in this story, so I really don't recommend reading it unless you're really interested in old fiction. But tying this back to our video series, this novel's version of Atlantis has almost nothing of Plato in it. The continent shape is completely different. Gone are Plato's rings of land and sea. The city is different. Instead of three great walls sheathed in metal, there's a single wall of great and heavy stonework. Egypt isn't an enemy state, but a remote and poor struggling colony. Athens isn't even on the radar here. There is a great colony in Mexico centered on the Yucatan Peninsula. Plato would ask, what the hell is a Mexico? The continent isn't divided into 10 autonomous states, but ruled directly from a single city with a single king chosen by a caste of sun-worshipping priests. This is also a somewhat more advanced civilization than Plato would present to us, having machines able to draw power from the sun to propel their wooden ships, so they haven't industrialized. They also don't have the printing press. I think some of this ties into the fact that the priestly caste in the book puts a lot of effort into keeping knowledge secret. And if you want to keep your knowledge secret, the last thing you want is a printing press. The only thing I could consider as surviving from Plato is the moral element, has the Empress's government is shown as decadent and degenerate, and the destruction of Atlantis is presented as the punishment of angry gods, or at least the punishment of their priest. Basically, Atlantis, the Lost Continent, is set completely in Donnelly's version of Atlantis and just borrows some faint fragments of Plato's work. It also uses Donnelly's idea of all flood myths being a retelling of the doom of Atlantis, as our main character, Ducalen, is actually named after the Greek mythological survivor of a flood. In the Greek myth, Zeus floods the earth after humanity grew prideful and sinful, and only a man named Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survived. In the story, Deucalion and the woman who love, who isn't named Pyrrha for some reason, survived the death of Atlantis by writing it out in an ancient ark. Again, Donnelly's influence is almost completely triumphant over Plato's here, but I do have the comfort of at least one elephant in this story, as the Empress tames a great woolly mammoth to ride as proof of her power. And as proof goes, it's pretty good proof. There is one thing I want to bring up as an aside, though. In the story, Deucalion finds out towards the end that the Yucatan colony has been overrun and destroyed by a race of short, hairy cannibal dwarves, who have basically killed and eaten every Atlantean who didn't flee the New World. I'm left wondering if this was meant to invoke a myth from a number of North American plain tribes, such as the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, who did have legends of child-sized, super strong, and hairy cannibal enemy tribes, who they had to fight to the last man because, well, they wouldn't stop kidnapping and eating people. Which, to be fair, is a good reason to fight a war against someone. I think stop eating me is a fair ask. I wanted to mention it, but I won't go into depth into this myth. I think I'm going to save it for a creature feature after we finish our look at Atlantis. Tell me if you're interested in that in the comments, though. Well, I hope you found this video informative or at least entertaining. If so, please leave a like, comment, or even subscribe. All those really helped me in my struggle against the dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. If you'd like to support this channel even further, consider joining the ranks of my Everwise patrons, whose votes decide content such as this very video. Speaking of which, special thanks to Big Steve, my biggest supporter. Next week, we're going to take a look at another piece of fiction that provides the origin of Atlanteans surviving under the sea after the continent sunk. We're looking at The Maricot Deep by none other than the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So until then, take care of yourselves, each other, and of course, keep reading.